Hello, my name is Abid Ahmed. I'm in section ST2 and I will be going over the history of steel, the ingredients inside steel, and also how it is manufactured. So let's start with the history of steel. The history of steel. Steel, before the 19th century, metals had little structural roles in buildings. They were used in, let's say, niche manners by the Greeks and the Romans. Every once in a while, in a certain sculpture, they would have steel incorporated, or no, not steel, some sort of metal incorporated into the structure for sometimes architectural effect, right? This was because that steel was actually a very luxurious product at the time. It was very expensive to make, it was very expensive to procure, so it was not really all that used in construction. Interesting enough, the first ever metal construction was built in the late 18th century. It was a whole iron bridge. It was built in England. It still carries people today, actually. So it kind of goes to show how effective metal is in structural integrity. So what happened was with these metals, steel and whatnot, they became a lot more popular after the 19th century due to this process called the Bessemer process. This process pioneered the cheap procurance of steel. The way this process works is it basically blows air into a vessel of molten iron, which I'll go over more later on. This method could make steel from a large batch of iron in about 20 minutes, actually. There was also another method called the Open-hearth method, which was developed in Europe and was eventually brought to the US. All these methods, eventually, what they did was by 1889, the Eiffel Tower is made entirely of wrought iron. So you could see that metal is actually becoming a lot more popular as time went on. So let's delve more deeply into steel itself. So what is steel? All these ferrous based metals, they have a level of carbon inside of them. And this carbon is actually really important to the structural integrity of the material, right? So too much carbon makes the material too hard but too brittle, so it has no ductility, but too little carbon makes the metal too soft and too malleable. Um, all alloys of iron that contain less than 2% carbon are considered steel. So structural steel itself contains actually less than 0.3% of carbon, as well as beneficial elements such as manganese and whatnot. Cast iron actually contains 3 to 4% of carbon. So remember how I mentioned that too much carbon makes material too hard or too brittle? Cast iron falls in that category. Cast iron is extremely hard and extremely brittle. Wrought iron contains less carbon than most steel alloys, actually. Interesting enough. Okay, so the manufacturing of steel. Steel is manufactured from cast iron, mainly. So cast iron is made from blasting iron ore, coke, and limestone. Coke is basically coal, only it has only carbon inside it, nothing else, right? So when the coke burns, it creates carbon monoxide, which reacts with the cast iron to leave it only as its elemental form, only Fe, right? This elemental iron molts into liquid and is then held in a liquid state to be converted into steel. When it's in this liquid state, pure oxygen is blown into the molten iron to burn off excess carbon and impurities. Lime and other elements are added in order to form slag with other impurities that make them easily discarded. So it's interesting. You don't actually use the lime in the steel for like structural integrity. You use it so that it can react with other impurities so that you can easily discard from the steel, right? Some beneficial ingredients that are added into the steel. There's manganese, which gives resistance to abrasion, molybdenum, which gives strength, nickel and chromium, which give corrosion resistance. Steel is generally made in electric arc furnaces. These furnaces are much smaller than conventional furnaces used before. Most steel is gathered from defunct automobiles. So the way the steel, most steel is gathered from defunct automobiles. So interestingly enough, one mini mill could consume about 300,000 cars a year on average. It really recycles as much metal as possible to create steel. So in conclusion, steel is created using iron ore. It's manufactured by making this iron ore into cast iron, which is then put into its elemental form by burning coke, having coke react with it, and then after that, oxygen is blown inside of it to make it become steel.